Dinesh, we have to get one elephant out of the room, or at least discuss the elephant in the room. Everyone talks about it. It was in the fact check. Your felony conviction for voter, what was it? Voter fraud, voting fraud.
No, but anyway,
it was for what was it? It was for campaign contribution. No, I'm sorry, exceeding. I don't know how they got you on a felony conviction for this. I mean, I understand how they got you on it, but I want you to explain it so I can ask my questions. You were nailed hard with the full force of the system for allegedly exceeding the lawful limit of individual campaign donations, because apparently, whatever it was, $5,000 per person, you, by the allegations, by the interwebs, told friends you would reimburse them if they donated to the campaign, which you did afterwards. And I just, how does anyone find out? How did this happen? How did you get convicted or plead guilty to a felony? You're 8 months in a midway home, or whatever they call it. I need to know all these details, but especially I need to hear the story from you, because I've read the details. I can play it out in my head, but I want to hear it from you, from you.
Okay, so here's a little bit of context. when a kid like me comes to America from India and leaves my family behind and essentially never goes home, what happens is, in reality, you create in America surrogate families. And so I had a group of conservative friends at Dartmouth who became sort of my extended American family. One of them was a young woman named Wendy Long, who years later in New York decided to run for the US Senate. It was a completely quixotic, improbable campaign, obviously a heavily Democratic state. But there was a Dartmouth woman, Kirsten Gillibrand, who's the current senator from New York. And so Wendy Long decided, I'm from Dartmouth, I'm going to challenge her. I'm like, Wendy, don't do that. But she's like, I'm going to do it. So I'm like, okay, I'll help you. So I gave Wendy the $10,000 that I'm allowed to give under the campaign finance limit. So I knew I was maxed out. But what happened is I released my film on Obama, and I'm running around the country promoting the film. I'm in Dallas, I'm in St. Louis. And what's happening is Wendy, whose campaign is in desperate straits, is calling me. Hey, Dinesh, can you serve on my finance committee? Hey, Dinesh, I'm meeting with some Indian doctors. You're Indian, they're Indian. Can you sit down with them? Maybe they'll give me some money. And I'm like, I felt bad that I couldn't help a friend of mine whom I'd known for 20 years. So I came up with a cockamamie scheme. I called up two of my friends. I said, hey, do you like Wendy Long? Give her $10,000. I'll reimburse you. It was kind of my way of pitching into the Wendy Long campaign. I knew she was going to lose. So this had nothing to do. Had nothing to gain. I didn't even tell Wendy Long I was doing it. So somehow the government finds out. Now, this is a first-time offense. There's no quid pro quo. I don't have anything to gain. Normally, these campaign finance laws are there for that. If you're trying to buy a judgeship by filtering all these straw donations, the law then goes after you, and rightly so. You're trying to get a tax benefit for your company. That's what the laws are there for. But in my case, they decided, let's prosecute this guy to the full extent of the law. But even the full extent of the law doesn't allow you to do very much, because in all of American history, no one has actually been locked up for doing what I did. Not one person ever. So they come to me and they say, they say, did you exceed the campaign finance law? And I go, guys, I did, and I should get obviously the same penalty as anybody else who did that. And they go, not so fast. Do you realize we can get you on bank fraud? And I go, bank fraud? What bank fraud have I done? They go, well, you took the money out of your bank account. Bank fraud. Then they go, we're also going to get you with mail fraud. And I go, mail fraud? And they go, yeah, because you put your check in the mail. And so they were literally trying to add charges upon charges and tell me that if I didn't plead, I would be facing years in prison. I would never, I wouldn't be seeing my daughter at a time when she was in her teens. So they try to ruin your life, and they use the bludgeon of additional charges, which is nothing more than redescribing the same thing in 5 different ways. And then they say, and then when you plead, they go, look, he admitted it. He admitted he did it. And of course, I always admitted I did it. But my point was, you're selectively prosecuting me. You're prosecuting me with a rigor that is never applied to anyone else. You're doing that because I'm a political opponent. It says that right here in my FBI file. You're red flagging me as a political opponent of Obama. So this is, in a nutshell, what my case was all about. And so I decided, look, I'll take the plea. I got the overnight confinement, which I did uncomplainingly. And then when I was on my long 5-year probation, in the middle of that, I got the pardon, which was really not important from the point of view of the penalty. I'd already done it. But it was more just that it cleared my record. It meant I could vote again. So that, in a nutshell, is a full and accurate account of my election fraud violation.
Yeah, for those who don't know the context, bundling is extremely commonplace. So it happens every single law firm, happens a lot of big business firms, happens everybody. And what is, if you have a bunch of lawyers, you can find out a way to make it quote unquote legal. That's it. But bundling happens all the time. And they took a very small bundling case that had no consequence and blew it up into the biggest campaign finance case ever. And it was, pre-Ferrara, infamous for his politically motivated prosecutions when he was running the Southern District of New York under Barack Obama. And I think still constitutionally, I mean, they made a good decision in the Cruz case. I have never liked campaign finance caps because my argument has been all it will do is be politicized and weaponized. Have transparency, let everybody know who's given to what. But the whole point is, the only constitutional basis for any of these laws is quid pro quo corruption. My view is then that should be superimposed on every civil fine and criminal prosecution. If you can't prove quid pro quo, you shouldn't be allowed to punish anyone for laws that are only considered constitutional because they're supposed to be constricting quid pro quo. They've used these cases. They've almost never used these cases in actual quid pro quo cases. I mean, the Clintons walked on the Chinese bundling that was off the charts. I mean, that was bundling to a whole new level. I mean, the Clinton Foundation, this is the same Southern District of New York, can take its time to go after you and could never find time for the Clinton Foundation. Somehow all those millions and millions and millions of dollars to someone who was Secretary of State to the foundation at the time she's Secretary of State is just kosher. I mean, it is a sad disgrace. I think the only upside of it is like with James O'Keefe, it awoke you up to certain problems in our system that you've worked hard to expose since then.
I mean, look at Zuckerberg. I mean, I give $20,000. I'm locked up for 8 months. This guy puts almost $500 million into the 2020 campaign. He has his own leftist activists infiltrating election offices. He's using financial leverage on cities and counties, basically saying, if you want my money, you've got to put all these drop boxes out there. And if you don't do that, I'm going to take my money back. I mean, the idea that a private citizen can exercise that kind of power over a nation's election process is unbelievable. And yet this is a guy who's able to get away with it.
Dinesh, I just want everyone to appreciate that the extent of your crime was two people donated $5,000 and you agreed to reimburse them for their donation to the campaign, thus exceeding your $5,000 or $10,000 limit.
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone, you can judge accordingly. I mean, to me, it's nuts. I question as to whether or not you could have actually raised dishonest arguments as opposed to admitting to it. Whether or not going for a trial, if you would have gotten the same treatment that Michael Sussman got, benefit of the jury, who knows? But the one thing, it still blows my mind. I need to know what it looks like. He was sentenced to 8 months in a halfway house near his home in San Diego. 5 years probation, $30,000 fine. 2018 issued a pardon by Donald Trump. From Wikipedia. 8 months in a halfway house?
So a halfway house is a federal confinement center. It's like a prison, but it's not a white collar or a blue collar prison. By and large, when people complete their prison sentences, it's intended to be a transitional facility to keep you under confinement, but prepare you to be released back into society. That's what these confinement centers do. Now, in my case, I wasn't there 24/7. I was sentenced to check in the evening at 7 p.m. I slept in a dorm with another 160 generally hardened criminals. A lot of them had served 10, 15 years, but this was the end of their sentence. We slept in dorms and we ate prison food. And I checked out in the morning. So I was allowed to get out in the day and go work, but I checked back in at night. And this went on for 8 months. I obviously couldn't travel or do any kind of speaking or any of that other stuff that's part of my normal life. So I got to meet some very interesting characters that I wouldn't normally have met in the course of ordinary life. And I saw a slice of America I would never have seen otherwise.
I'm going to say this is my own neuroses. This is my own life talking. That sounds like, I mean, to sleep somewhere else for 8 months sounds like hell on earth. It sounds like summer camp, but the worst kind. What was that experience like? Who did you meet? What were some memorable experiences? And do you consider that to be, I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, is that value added to your life right now? Or are you actually thankful for that experience?
Well, it was traumatic when I was going through it, particularly at the beginning. I mean, basically, you know, I'm a sheltered kid. I mean, I'm not somebody who's used to that kind of rough street life. And you have guys here. I mean, you had, you know, white supremacists who had tattoos on their back. They were in white gangs. You had black gangs. You had Hispanic gangs. There were people talking to me about the Mexican mafia was in the, you know, confinement center. So interestingly, it was immediately obvious to people that I was sort of a different kind of animal. And I remember a very amusing conversation early on where a bunch of these guys were telling me, the first thing you have to do is tell people what you did. And so they're like, one guy's like, I did this. I was a coyote. You know, I was a drug smuggler. I was this, I was that. Well, what do you do? So I'm like, well, I exceeded the campaign finance law. And they were like, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And I'm like, well, I gave money to a college friend of mine who was running for office. And they were like, yeah, and then what? Then what? And I'm like, no, that's it. That's what I did. And they kept thinking that I had taken somebody else's money. It was really hard for me to explain that I was giving away my own money. They couldn't understand how that could possibly qualify as some kind of an offense, giving away too much of your own money. So these guys just begin to start laughing their head off. First of all, they accuse me of lying. And I'm like, no, I'm not lying. That's actually what my case is about. And so eventually they began to treat me as just this very odd character. Who was among them, but they treated me quite well. I never felt I was in real danger. In fact, if I can be honest with you, I felt in far greater danger of the people who ran the facility putting drugs in my locker or something like that than I did of any of the so-called criminals that I was with. I felt perfectly safe among them. I felt less safe in the hands of the U.S. government.